In this episode of Cosmic Sponge, Jim returns from his Bigfoot hunt out west. UFO expert claims Will Smith likely keeps aliens away with his film career, and Oscar antics. A series of mysterious deaths in a mountain pass thought to have paranormal roots may have been solved. An alien resembling a hairless possum washes up on an Australian beach. For our main topic, we look into the mother of all UFO stories with part one of a two-part special on the Roswell UFO crash. And remember, part one of Roswell Cover-Up Uncovered is brought to you by the number 27. Max shrugged his shoulders, laid back down, closed his eyes, counted 27 sheep and fell asleep.
27. Pretty specific number.
I'll get to that.
Welcome to Cosmic Sponge, the podcast where we discuss UFOs and other weird wonders in the world. I'm Stephen Hawk.
And I'm Jimmy Coe.
Tonight, we have a very special episode. This is part one of a two-part episode where we are going to look at perhaps the most famous UFO case in history, and that is the Roswell incident. This is a subject that we have known that we need to cover since the very first episode. Over the past year or so, I've been doing a lot of research on and off and reading a few books and a lot of articles about this. And we want to try and dig down and get to the bottom of, are there aliens? Was there a crash saucer? Is there a massive government conspiracy cover-up? Is that where spandex and Velcro came from, that it was reverse engineered from some crash UFO?
And so, Tang.
Maybe.
Tang is dehydrated blood of aliens.
But before we get into that, Jimmy, you just got back from being out west in Oregon and California trying to track down our favorite hominid, Bigfoot. How was that trip?
Okay, everybody knows I'm not a big fan of Bigfoot actually existing. That's until I went out west. Now I've upped it a couple percentage points because let me tell you, those woods are big, deep, dark, scary-looking woods. Not like East Coast woods, man. We're talking some dense, large tree growth out there. And, I'm thinking maybe. And you can't throw a rock without hitting some kind of kiosk or person selling something dealing with Bigfoot up in Oregon.
Really?
It's big industry up there. I think it's craft beers and then Bigfoot. Those are the two big industries in Oregon.
I'm sure there's Bigfoot or Sasquatch beer labels up there too, right?
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah, just mix the two, right?
Yeah, you better be big and strong to be able to take it, though.
One thing that was funny, you sent me a picture. Someone had taken a chainsaw and I guess carved out of a tree what looked like a giant Bigfoot, and you're kind of making fun, like, I'm going to take on Bigfoot. But also at the bottom of the tree, I noticed they had carved a little raccoon.
Yep.
And knowing your history with raccoons, I was kind of curious, was that actually you were going to attack Bigfoot or was it the raccoon?
It was the raccoon. Bigfoot might have been protecting him, but I was going to go for the raccoon. I'll snap his little neck.
If you're new to the show, Jimmy is a former, what do you call it?
Chicken farmer. Actually, Copenhagen comes from Koppenhofer, which I think in German is chicken farmer.
You're making that up.
I am not. Look it up.
Look it up. All right. Pretty good trip then?
It's a pretty good trip. We drove down the coast. It was Route 101, Route 1, back and forth. And we just took the coast all the way down. It's pretty spectacular scenery and a lot of Bigfoot stuff. Stopped in a museum and got to talk to the guy there. And the guy running the Bigfoot Museum had a sighting of his own when he was a little kid. He was camping with his parents out in, I think it was Northern California. They were making fish and he didn't want fish. So he ran away from the campsite up to the tree line. And there at the tree line was a big hairy man. He was real young at the time.
Keeping an eye on everybody.
Right. So he goes back to tell his parents because it freaked him out. And they're like, nah, that's just a vagrant. And he's like, it's at that point that I learned that a vagrant was a completely fur-covered, 10-foot tall man.
Oh, man, that's pretty neat. Did you hand him one of their cosmic sponge cards?
Yeah,
Put it up in the shop?
I left them all up and down the coast, man. They're all over the place.
Well, that's awesome. If you happen to find one of Jimmy's cards and you're tuning in, then welcome to the show.
You mail me the card, and I'll mail you back some Bigfoot stuff if you find one.
Oh, did you hear that, listeners? If you find a cosmic sponge card anywhere, you know what? I'm going to start leaving them all over the place, too.
Yeah.
Do they have a place to send it to? I guess just email the show and maybe email us a picture
of
you holding the card, and then we'll send you some Bigfoot paraphernalia.
Yeah.
Or maybe UFO stuff. Who knows? We got a whole big box of junk.
Junk.
Yeah.
Cool stuff.
Yeah. Pair of junk.
That's right. Pair of junk. That's so stupid.
In all of your travels, have you ran across any decent news stories lately?
I ran across several. I want to get the sad one out of the way so that then we can move on to the fun ones.
Yeah.
This
Don't
week,
want to have some bummer and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So John Lear, who was a avid UFO follower and was an outspoken critic of alleged government cover-ups of UFOs. He just passed away this week on Tuesday. His father, of course, was Bill Lear, who created the Learjet. John himself worked for the CIA during the Vietnam era and flew cargo planes. You know, he just passed away this week. He was also a friend to Bob Lazar. However you feel about him, still was part of the community. So I was a little sad to see that. And I think we should just follow that one up and get this out of the way, too, because anyone who's watched the Oscars this week, and I'll make this quick, Will Smith smacked Chris Rock. Okay, everybody knows.
I was going to say, don't make me come up there and pull a Will Smith on you, man.
But this actually has some paranormal news as well, because UFO expert, this is the title of the article I found, UFO expert genuinely believes aliens could be scared of Will Smith after watching the Oscars.
Is it Nick Pope?
It's Nick Pope.
It's really?
It is. Nick Pope, 53, worked for the British government and probed UFOs for the MOD and said it's likely that extraterrestrial life is aware of our existence and could even be monitoring us. He said it would be easy for an advanced race to watch our television shows, but not be aware of what fiction is, and might think that Men in Black and Independence Day are documentaries, both of which has Will Smith kicking alien butt. And then he says after watching the Oscars, where Smith appeared to slap comedian Chris Rock, any life form thinking about visiting Earth might now be rethinking it.
Yeah, that's a good point. On the other hand, what if they're a race of Klingons from Star Trek or something, and they're warlike, and they saw, Will Smith jump up on stage and slap Chris Rock and think it's some kind of like duel challenge or something? They might be all into that. See, we just don't know what these alleged aliens may think. Nick Pope comes out with the alien perspective on just about everything that happens in the news.
Well, what if they are watching it and that's how they reproduce? Will might be in for a really unhappy time. Or maybe a happy time. Who am I to say?
Happy time. Hey, don't knock until you try, right?
I'm not here to judge.
Yeah.
Do you got any good news stories?
Oh, nothing that good, but you've heard of the Dyatlov Pass in Russia. You know where I'm talking about, where back in 1959, there was 9 Russian hikers that disappeared. They were doing a cross-country skiing trip through the Ural Mountains.
Oh, yeah.
They were very experienced mountaineers. They all disappeared, and whenever rescuers finally found their camp, they were discovered under very strange circumstances. It looked as if they'd cut their way out of the tent. Several of them had run away from their camp in like their underwear, no shoes. Most of them died of hypothermia. They had some that were missing their eyes. Just a really strange disappearance. And again, experienced outdoors people who had done this sort of thing before. Since that time, this incident has entered the world of maybe it was UFOs, it was the Yeti, it was strange Ural Mountain spirits that caused all this sort of stuff. And then all along, some people's been saying, hey, maybe it was an avalanche. A little more of a boring explanation. There's a recent report that just came out. Let me see if I can find it here. And we may do a story on this whole, I mean, this is one of those paranormal stories that make the rounds on everything. So who knows, maybe someday we will cover this more in depth ourselves. But in 2019, the Russian Public Prosecutor's Office resurrected the case from its archives. Johann Guam, who heads the Snow and Avalanche Simulation Laboratory in Switzerland, received a call from a New York journalist looking for insight into the mystery. Make a long story short, him and another engineer from Zurich, Switzerland, Alexander Persen, they spent quite a bit of time looking at this and published their findings in January 2021 and said that most likely that tragedy was a slab avalanche. Mm-hmm. And some people had said in the past that the avalanches didn't occur in this part of the country, and they actually have proof that, yes, while they were there, a slab avalanche had actually occurred. And so one of the arguments against an avalanche all along was we would have seen the remains of that because the rescuers were there 2 weeks after they disappeared. They would have seen the avalanche, but the remains of the avalanche. We'd have been able to tell this avalanche had happened. And they proved, because they were there either when the avalanche happened or one had just happened, recorded all that, and then returned just a few weeks later, and it's like all traces of the avalanche were covered up and gone. There was no trace of it. And there was a whole lot of other factors that led to that, but they believe that's what, 100% believe that's what caused this strange death and disappearance. And of course, it was loud, making a lot of noise, and they cut their way out of the tent because, they were covered up with snow and all those things. So, makes a lot of sense. Not quite as exotic as the Yeti or something, but
yeah,
most likely that is what we are looking at. So I posted this story, and it's very in depth. I posted this story, listeners, if you want to jump on our Facebook page and check it out.
Yeah, I have one more story, actually a couple, but I'm just going to do one more because it's really short and it made me chuckle. So the title of this article is okay. Man finds alien that looks like de-haired possum with claws washed up on an Australian beach.
How does he know it's an alien then? Maybe it's not. Is it sure it's not just a de-haired possum?
A man taking
Land of the marsupials.
Land of the marsupials. A man taking a morning walk on an Australian beach stumbled across a creature that he says may be from out of this world. Instagram user Alex Tan posted the video of a dead animal or possible extraterrestrial on Tuesday, with hundreds of people commenting on what they think it is. This is something you see when people claim they found aliens, he said in the clip. How weird is that? Tan said it looked like a de-haired possum, but looked different from anything else he had ever encountered. People in the comments said it could be a dead rat or a dead carcass of a kangaroo. And then somebody chimed in, maybe it's a mini chupacabra.
Chupacabra.
And the final take on it was, I'm almost certain it's a ringtail possum. Skull and dentition match up. Hands look the same, and the size is about right, too. Another typed.
So, not an alien then.
Not an alien. Likely. Looks pretty weird, though.
Yeah.
I'll put it up on the Facebook. People can go and look at this weird ring-tailed possum, de-haired alien.
All right. Well, let's move on to tonight's topic. But before we do, I'd like to remind everyone, please rate and review the podcast. Now, I say that every week, but especially if you're listening on Apple iTunes or Apple Podcasts, it really helps bump us up in the search engine to help other people find our show. Now, we've seen some very significant growth lately. Thank you to all the new listeners we have, and thank you for all the listeners that's been with us from the beginning or whenever you jumped in. We're so pleased to have so many listeners out there. It really makes doing this show worthwhile. If you would like to support the show, there's a couple of different ways you can do that. Just go to our webpage, cosmicsponge.com. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you will see a little coffee cup icon. That's called Buy Me a Coffee. You click on that, you can do a one-time donation. However, if you would like to support the show, then you can become a patron. Just click on, it looks like a little chain link right next to the coffee cup. Click on that. That will take you to Patreon, or you can go directly to patreon.com/cosmic sponge. From there, we have 3 different levels of very modest support levels to help us out and pay for, web servers and all that kind of stuff and grow the show. If you do become a patron, then you gain access to several things, but namely you would gain access to our extra show that we do exclusively for our Patreon supporters. That's called Weird Wonder Show. And we've recorded about 3 episodes of that so far, and we're going to keep recording them. So if you jump into it, who knows how many episodes, but if you say do it today, you'll get access to 3 episodes right away. And beyond that, check us out on Instagram. Jimmy does a lot of really cool stuff on that. Also on our webpage, we have a web store if you'd like to get a t-shirt or a coffee mug, some items like that. What have we got on there? Notebooks and water bottles. I think they're gold lined based on the price. But.
Yeah. We don't set the price. The print company does.
Yeah. It's really there for you listeners if you want to have some cool memorabilia that has our Cosmic Sponge logo on it. We really don't make anything on it. But anyway, it's there if you would like to have it. And so we got Instagram, and of course we're on YouTube. Some listeners are listening there now. So thank you for everyone that's been tuning in each and every week. So on to tonight's show. Like I said at the beginning, we are looking at Roswell. This is perhaps the most famous UFO incident. And also, I feel as if Roswell, when I look at it, and I've been interested in UFOs for a long time. So I can remember before there was Roswell. In a way, to me, there's a paradigm shift in the whole phenomenon. There's before Roswell, when you had Dr. Hynek, formerly of Project Blue Book, looking at all the different phenomenon. And then along comes Roswell, government cover-up, recovered saucer, recovered aliens. That sort of becomes the narrative from that point forward. What we want to look at tonight on episode 1 is we want to just look at the phenomenon in a chronological way. What are all of the details, where it all began, and where we are now with this phenomenon. Next week on part 2, we're going to dig deeper into some of these details. But tonight we mainly want to roll out the events and all of the players. So Jimmy, I know you've done a little legwork on the old Roswell incident. What do you have for us as on the way of an introduction?
It was a dark and stormy night in June of 1947 on the J.B. Foster Sheep Ranch. Foreman Jack Brazel was trying to go to sleep by counting sheep as the storm raged outside. Occasionally a thunderclap would cause him to lose count, but no matter to Mac, he'd just start over. 1 little lamb, 2 little lambs, 3 little lambs. On and on he'd count, and he'd almost fell into a deep sleep when suddenly a sound so loud it was like an explosion rather than a thunderclap. Mac jumped straight out of his bed, made his way to the window, peering anxiously out into the darkness. The familiar landscape would pop into view with each flash of lightning, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. Mac shrugged his shoulders, laid back down, closed his eyes, counted 27 sheep, and fell asleep.
27. Pretty specific number.
I'll get to that. The next day, Mac went to work, checking on the livestock, whistling some cowboy tunes, and doing all the things ranch foremen do when he suddenly came across a debris field containing some awfully strange materials, gathered them up, and eventually would take them to town, making his way to the Army base at Roswell. What happened next would eventually culminate into the greatest story in the history of UFOs. Flying saucers and little gray men. For the world, it would launch several TV series about teenage aliens played by 20-somethings with nice skin and perfect teeth. Fill up bookshelves with stories about extraterrestrials and government conspiracies. Create a big headache for the United States Air Force and land poor old Mac into military custody, complete with bad food and a rectal examination. And this intro is just another retelling of the beginning of the most famous flying saucer tale to ever be told. A fine example of how difficult it can be to find the truth, behind a wall of stories cobbled together over 70-plus years since it first landed on the front page of newspapers in July of 1947. In this episode, we're going to try to lay out the story best as we can and supply some additional background and details left out of many of the versions of the stories that we've looked at as we try to get to the bottom of the Roswell UFO crash.
And I think it's important to start with the Kenneth Arnold sighting. Now, we covered the Kenneth Arnold sighting in part way back in episode 3, The History of UFOs Part 1 Declassified, and also some follow-up in episode 37. Kenneth Arnold had his sighting on June 24th, 1947, near Mount Rainier. He saw 7 or 8 actually kind of delta-shaped objects that he said moved as if they were saucers being skipped on water. And then that's where the whole phrase flying saucer came from. And the whole country went flying saucer crazy, and they started seeing flying saucers everywhere. So it was very much in the news, very much in the public imagination in 1947. Now, just 2 weeks after that, in a newspaper, the Roswell Daily Record, the headline says, RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. And this was on July 8th. So from June 24th to July 8th, everyone's talking about flying saucers, UFOs, and then we get this headline. And Jimmy, I think you have that newspaper headline handy there. So what did the newspaper say on that day?
RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. No details of flying disc are revealed. Roswell hardware man and wife report disc seen. The intelligence office of the 509th Bombardment Group at Roswell Army Field announced at noon today that the field has come into possession of a flying saucer. According to information released by the department, over authority of Major J.A. Marcel, intelligence officer, the disc was recovered on a ranch in the Roswell vicinity after an unidentified rancher had notified Sheriff Geo Wilcox that he had found the instrument on his premises. Major Marcel and a detail from his department went to the ranch and recovered the disc, it was stated. After the intelligence officer here had inspected the instrument, it was flown to higher headquarters. The intelligence office stated that no details of the saucer's construction or its appearance had been revealed. The second paragraph goes over some additional details from a Mr. and Mrs. Dan Wilmot. Apparently, we're the only persons in Roswell who's seen what they thought was a flying disc. They were sitting on their porch at 105 South Penn last Wednesday night at about 10 o'clock when a large glowing object zoomed out of the sky from the southeast, going in a northwesterly direction at a high rate of speed. Wilmot called Mrs. Wilmot's attention to it, and they both ran down to the yard to watch. It was in sight less than a minute, perhaps 40 or 50 seconds, Wilmot estimated. Wilmot said that it appeared to him to be about 1,500 feet high and going fast. He estimated between 400 and 500 miles an hour. In appearance, it looked like an oval and shaped like two inverted saucers faced mouth to mouth, or like two old-type wash balls placed together in the same fashion.
That was just one example of the newspaper report. Once this hit the AP wire, this was repeated all over the country. The phone, no doubt, was ringing off the hook at Roswell Air Force Base and Air Force bases all over, I am sure, as well as the sheriff's office right there in Roswell, New Mexico. But then, right afterwards, there was another article
from the Roswell Daily Record, July 9, 1947, the following day. General Ramey empties Roswell saucer. Ramey says excitement is not justified. General Ramey says disc is weather balloon. Fort Worth, Texas, July 9th. An examination by the Army revealed last night that the mysterious objects found on a lonely New Mexico ranch was a harmless, high-altitude weather balloon, not a grounded flying disc. Excitement was high until Brigadier General Roger M. Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Forces with headquarters here, cleared up the mystery. The bundle of tinfoil, broken wood beams, and rubber remnants of a balloon were sent here yesterday by Army Air Transport in the wake of reports that it was a flying disc. But the general said the objects were the crushed remains of a ray wind target used to determine the direction and velocity of winds at high altitudes. Warrant Officer Irving Newton, forecaster at the Army Air Force's weather station here, said, "We use them because they go much higher than the eye can see." The weather balloon was found several days ago near the center of New Mexico by rancher W.W. Brazel. He said he didn't think much about it until he went into Corona, New Mexico last Saturday and heard the flying disc reports that had been making the circuits. He returned to his ranch, 85 miles northwest of Roswell, recovered the wreckage of the balloon, which he had placed under some brush, and brought it in. Brazel hurried back to Roswell, where he reported his find to the sheriff's office. The sheriff called the Roswell airfield, and Major Jesse A. Marcel, 509th Bomb Group Intelligence Officer, was assigned to the case. Colonel William H. Blanchard, commanding officer of the bomb group, reported the find to General Ramey, and the object was flown immediately to the airfield here. Ramey went on the air here last night to announce the New Mexico discovery was not a flying disc. Newton said that when rigged up, the instrument looks like a six-pointed star, is silvery in appearance, and rises in the air like a kite. In Roswell, the discovery set off a flurry of excitement. Sheriff George Wilcox's phone lines were jammed. 3 calls came in from England, 1 from the London Daily Mail, he said. A public relations officer here said the balloon was in his office, and it will probably stay right there. Newton, who made the examination, said some 80 weather stations in the U.S. were using that type of balloon, and that it could have come from any one of them. He said he had set up identical balloons during the invasion of Okinawa to determine ballistics information for heavy guns.
We have the news release on July 8th. Before the end of the day, General Ramey, who was head of the 8th Air Force, had already went on the radio and said, look, because once people heard they had found one of these flying saucers, and then within hours, General Ramey gets on the radio and says, no, we haven't. This is just a weather balloon. Everybody calm down. This is not it. Now, also accompanying that article are some pictures of Jesse Marcel, General Ramey, and is it Du Bois? I think he's an aide to General Ramey, that are posing with the debris, which looks like crinkled up tinfoil. And I mean, they're very famous photographs. You can see them anywhere. You can see them on our Facebook page. I just posted an article about Roswell, and that's Major Jesse Marcel holding a piece of the wreckage. The next article that we'll talk about is was also published on July 9th in the Daily Record. Now, this was the first newspaper that published that the Army had found a disc. This is the very next day, and this is an interview with William Brazel. He's a Lincoln County rancher living 30 miles southeast of Corona. Today, he told his story, finding out what the Army at first described was a flying disc, but the publicity which attended his find caused him to add that if he ever found anything short of a bomb, he sure wasn't going to say anything about it. Brazel related that on June 14th, he and his 8-year-old son Vernon were about 7 or 8 miles from the ranch house of the J.B. Foster Ranch, which he operates, when they came upon a large area of bright wreckage made up of rubber strips, tinfoil, a rather tough paper, and sticks. At the time, Brazel was in no hurry to get his round made, and he did not pay much attention to it, but he did remark about what he had seen, and on July 4th, he and his wife, Vernon, and daughter Betty, age 14, went back to the spot and gathered up quite a bit of the debris. The next day, he first heard about the flying discs, and he wondered if what he had found might be the remnants of one of these. Monday, he came to town to sell some wool, and while here, he went to see Sheriff George Wilcox and whispered kind of confidential-like that he might have found a flying disc. Wilcox got in touch with the Roswell Army Airfield, Major Jesse Marcel, and a man in plain clothes accompanied him, where they picked up the rest of the pieces of the disc and went to his home to try and reconstruct it. According to Brazel, they simply could not reconstruct it at all. They tried to make a kite out of it, but could not do that and could not find any way to put it back together so that it would fit. Then Major Marcel brought it to Roswell, and that was the last he heard of it until the story broke that he had found a flying disc. Brazel said he did not see it fall from the sky. He did not see it before it was torn up, so he did not know the size or shape it might have been, but he thought it might have been about as large as a tabletop. The balloon which held it up, if that was how it worked, must have been about 12 feet long, he felt, measuring the distance by the size of the room in which he sat. The rubber was a smoky gray in color and scattered over an area about 200 yards in diameter. When the debris was gathered up, the tinfoil, paper, tape, and sticks made a bundle about 3 feet long and 7 or 8 inches thick, while the rubber made a bundle of about 18 or 20 inches long and about 8 inches thick. In all, he estimated the entire lot would have weighed maybe 5 pounds. There was no sign of any metal in the area, which might have been used for an engine, and no sign of any propellers of any kind, although at least one paper fin had been glued onto some of the tinfoil. There were no words to be found anywhere on the instrument, although there were letters on some of the parts. Considerable Scotch tape and some tape with flowers printed upon it had been used in construction. No strings or wire were to be found, but there were some eyelets in the paper to indicate that some sort of attachment may have been used. Brazel said that he had previously found 2 weather balloons on the ranch, but that what he found this time did not in any way resemble either of these. I am sure what I found was not any weather observation balloon, he said. But if I find anything else besides a bomb, they're going to have a hard time getting me to say anything about it.
So my takeaway from this was that flying saucers are made by kindergarten classes.
Yeah, it's like a project for Easter. So that was Brazel's statement that was made the following day. Now, keep in mind, Mr. Brazel was a caretaker on a sheep ranch way out in the boonies. His family didn't even live with him. I think they were there for a visit. His wife and kids lived in another town so the kids could go to school. It was so remote. He had no telephone, no radio. I'm not sure if he had electricity or not. Here we are, a man who lives alone, lives an incredibly simple life, probably likes it that way, goes to town and gets bombarded by all these news people about maybe this is a flying saucer. So that was it. For the most part, this story disappeared until 30 years later. There is one notable exception that I do want to mention. There was a book by author Frank Scully, Behind the Flying Saucers, and it was published December 15th, 1950. In this book, the author relates a story about a government cover-up where there was a UFO crash near Aztec, New Mexico, and witnesses saw, alien bodies being recovered. And then since then, a lot of the details in this book have been totally debunked. We may get into that a little bit more later, but I think it's notable to mention it because some people say that this author just had some of the facts wrong, but had the basic facts of it correct, that there was a government cover-up about a UFO crash in the desert. He just had the place wrong and the date wrong and some other things wrong. But the gist of it is...
Other than the date, the people, the location, the time...
aliens and government recovery and cover-up.
Other than all that, it was perfect.
Other than that, it's dead on. But for really, the Roswell story disappeared for 30 years. No one thought anything else about it. Then in 1979, there was a researcher, very famous researcher. I'm sure listeners, you have seen this individual on plenty of documentaries. You've seen him on the news, and that's Stanton Friedman. He just passed away in 2019. He was a nuclear physicist and a professional ufologist. He, of course, had these scientific credentials, and he was a very big proponent of and he never called them UFOs. He always called them flying saucers because he said UFOs can be anything, right? But flying saucers are flying saucers. UFO means unidentified flying object. Could just be a light in the sky. But when I say flying saucer, I mean a spaceship full of aliens, essentially. But anyway, Stanton Friedman, and I've heard him explain this story on some documentaries, but he said that he was at a TV station somewhere. Someone said, who you really need to talk to is this guy, Jesse Marcel, because he handled one of those flying saucers you're always talking about when he was in the military. And so, of course, Stanton Friedman gets very excited. In 1978, Stanton Friedman interviews Jesse Marcel, and of course, Jesse Marcel rolls out this story of going out to the desert with Brazel, talks about the newspaper article. They find this crashed flying saucer, gets back to Roswell. The press officer for the Air Force Base, William Hunt, did a news release without authorization saying they'd found this flying disc. General Ramey hears about this. They clamp it down, come up with a cover story, and say that it's a crashed weather balloon. The next day, for all the newspaper people and all the newsmen that are there taking the photographs, that debris was switched out with a weather balloon or some kind of other debris. The actual UFO debris, the flying saucer debris, is on its way to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base to be investigated and disappears within the bowels of government conspiracy cover-up. And that's the story that was related. And I know that before the book came out, there was an old TV show called In Search Of that was hosted by Leonard Nimoy. I have seen that show, listeners. If you want to check it out, just pull up, I think it's called In Search Of Government Cover-Ups or something like that. And but anyway, it was a pretty good show, and that's the interview of Jesse Marcel. And also, if you watch the newer movie, The Phenomenon by James Fox, documentary on UFOs, Jimmy and I reference this movie a lot. They have parts of that interview with Jesse Marcel that aired in that episode on The Phenomenon as well. But you can go on YouTube and watch this interview, and that's where he tells the story. And I think they drive out to New Mexico and to the approximate area, and Jesse Marcel's probably in his 70s walking around telling this story that happened 30 years ago. There was a National Enquirer article that appeared as well, but the very first book that came out was called The Roswell Incident. It says, the most important UFO encounter of our century. It was published in 1980. The authors are Charles Berlitz and William L. Moore. Uncredited is Stanton Friedman, who is said to have also done some of the interviews and some research for this book. Now, this book is out of print, but listeners, I'm holding a copy of it in my hand because when I started doing my Roswell research, I thought, I want to go to the very first book that talks about Roswell. I don't want a book that's published last year. I don't want a book that was published 5 years ago. I want the very first one that lays out all the facts and started the whole ball rolling, right? I've ended up finding it at a used bookstore in Portland, I think. Did I tell you? Or was it in California? I don't remember. Oh. But anyway, I found it in a used bookstore and acquired it pretty cheaply. I think I got it for like $6. I got my receipt right here.
Riveting.
Riveting. This is good podcasting radio, right?
How much did you pay for it, Steve?
I don't know. I think it's about $6.
About 3,000 rubles, which is like $2.
Right. So the Roswell incident. Now, I mentioned the two authors. One of them, Charles Berlitz. Do you recognize that name, Jimmy?
Berlitz. Didn't he do something on the Philadelphia experiment?
He did. We had mentioned in another episode about the Bermuda Triangle. He was the author of the book, The Bermuda Triangle, and we talked about that book 2 episodes ago on our Bermuda Triangle episode. His book that was published in 1974 is the one that really put the Bermuda Triangle into the American psyche, maybe the world psyche. Sold something like 20 million copies. Now, I'm not going to get into a lot of criticism about this book or that book, but we did mention at the time on that episode that it has been proven that that book in particular, the one about the Bermuda Triangle, had a few inaccuracies in it. So let's just leave it at that. But next week, we're going to be talking more about this book and what is in it. And I read it about a year ago when we got into this thing, and I read parts of it again last night. I've actually read some of it 3 times, just so I could fully understand it. But the book is essentially broken into 2 parts. One tells the story of Jesse Marcel, just what we talked about. Jesse Marcel was interviewed. He talks about going out to the site with Brazel. Brazel at this time had passed away. He had passed away in 1963. Brazel's son, however, is interviewed in this book. I believe Brazel's sister is also interviewed in this book. But, it centers around Jesse Marcel and his story of picking up the debris and then posing with the fake debris and it being covered up by the government. It was actually a flying saucer. There's another part of this book. Now, the title of the chapter is Witnesses Speak, the Town Remembers. It is based on an interview of L.W. Vern Maltese and his wife, Jean, who had a friend named Barney Barnett, who had passed away by the time this book was published. But they told the authors that in February 1950, during a visit to Socorro, New Mexico, Barrett told his friends an extraordinary story. He and some students from the University of Pennsylvania were out in the desert and they came across a craft that was full of dead aliens. And about the time they got there, the military shows up and runs them all off. And so that was it. And then there was a government cover-up. Now, but then Socorro, Mexico, near Socorro and that is actually very far from Roswell. We're not quite sure how that works out. Now, later in some other books, some authors start trying to tie these two things together. But that particular interview, of course, was not first person, and it was a story that was told to someone in 1950. This book was published in 1980. That would have been 30 years after the story was told. So they couldn't go to the original person. And then the interviewers asked around town about the Barnett guy, the one that supposedly witnessed the aliens. And everyone's like, yeah, I remember Barnett. He was a stand-up guy. He wouldn't tell a story and so on and so forth. So there's that. There's some other interviews and some other details in this book as well, like the incident about the teletype machine. Jimmy, have you ever heard about that, where the lady was waiting for a news reporter all excited to tell a story? He said, get ready. I'm getting ready to send something over the wire.
Oh, I haven't heard this one at all. Hit me.
Lydia Sleppy worked for the radio station KOAT in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She was sitting at the teletype machine at the station at approximately 4 p.m. on July 7th. There was a call from Johnny McBoyle, a reporter, part owner to one of their sister stations in Roswell. The other station in Roswell had no teletype, so he called her and wanted to put it on the wire. And he said, Lydia, get ready for a scoop. We want to get this on the ABC wire right away. Listen to this. A flying saucer has crashed. No, I'm not joking. It crashed near Roswell. I've been there and seen it. It's like a big crumpled dishpan. Some rancher has hauled it under a cattle shelter with his tractor. The Army is there, and they are going to pick it up. The whole area is now closed off. And get this, they're saying something about little men being on board. Start getting this on the teletype right away while I'm on the phone. Let's see. Lydia placed the phone to her ear and shoulder, started to type McBoyle's startling statements into the teletype. But after she had typed only a few sentences, the machine suddenly stopped itself. They said that was a common occurrence. It would go offline every now and then, or whatever they called it in those days. And then while the machine wasn't responding, McBoyle tells her, wait a minute, I'll get back to you. Wait, I'll get right back. But then he did not. Instead, the teletype went off again. The sender was not identified, but this is the words that came across the teletype. Attention, Albuquerque. Do not transmit. Repeat, do not transmit this message. Stop communication immediately. Lydia had McBoyle on the telephone. She told him what happened, and she says, what do I do now? And his reply was, forget about it. You never heard it. Look, you're not supposed to know. Don't talk about it anymore. And then he later told Lydia that he had witnessed an airplane, which he said was destined for Wright Field.
So I have some questions about Mac Brazel. Maybe you can clear it up for me.
Okay.
My understanding when I first looked at Roswell years ago was that there was a storm on July the 2nd. And that's the storm that's referenced by most of the stories I have read and seen, is that on July the 2nd, there was a thunderstorm, presumably a loud explosion, Could have been a thunderclap, sounded more like an explosion to Brazel. He gets up the next day to assess the farm, primarily to look to see how the water has pooled around the farm so that he can move the sheep to a certain location to get better access to water. I think that's what they'd said. This would be on July 3rd. But the story that he gives in the newspaper was that he was out riding with his son on June the 14th. So does he find the debris field on June the 14th or July the 3rd?
I don't know if I remember that in the book.
Right. So in the 1947, July 9th, 1947, Roswell Daily Record Chronicle newspaper has the interview with Brazel. Brazel related that on June 14th, he and his 8-year-old son Vernon were about 7 or 8 miles from the ranch house of J.B. Foster Ranch, which he operates, when they came upon a large area of bright wreckage made up on rubber strips, tinfoil, and a rather tough paper and sticks. June 14th. So is that a misprint or... I have a problem with this timeline.
Right. And I'd heard that story before, and that's what Brazel said the next day in the paper. The impression that I have and what I've read is that that debris was in the field for a few days. Brazel has this debris, whether it was from the thunderstorm or not, we don't know. He doesn't say that in the newspaper article, at least the one that I have. You know, he didn't run right down to Roswell and go tell the sheriff. He knew the debris was there. Also, he had recovered a couple of weather balloons in the past. And I think at that time, now, I don't know that he did this specifically, but I do know in those days they used to launch a ton of weather balloons. The Air Force and whoever launched them would give a reward if you found a weather balloon, brought it by the base or wherever, and you could get some money because they wanted to recover their instruments. So I do know that he had stated that he had recovered or at least found 2 weather balloons on his on this property before. My understanding is that debris was out in the field for a few days because somewhere I had read that his sheep didn't want to go through it. They wanted to go around it to get to the water. And that was another thing that he found annoying. But he didn't know anything about the flying saucer phenomena at all until he drove into town. Now, he lived 30 miles, I think,
from Corona,
which was the nearest town. Again, he lived very isolated, no radio, no phone on this ranch, most of the time all alone. So he drives into town and everybody's talking about the UFOs because it's only a couple of weeks after the Kenneth Arnold sighting. They're calling them flying discs or flying saucers, and he's thinking, well, maybe that's what's down there on the ranch. Now, at this time, a lot of people speculated that it could have been something from the Russians. It could even be something from our own military, not necessarily a spaceship. But regardless of it, once he was in Corona, he made that connection that maybe this debris is one of these flying discs that everybody's talking about. And I'm not sure that he went to town right away. I think he had something else to do. Now, or in the newspaper, it says he went into town to sell wool. In the book, his son is interviewed and said that he didn't sell wool that way, but he also did not go into town to report this specifically. That he had went into town, he thought to maybe buy a new car, like a new Jeep. He had some kind of Jeep carryall. So it wasn't as if, I've got a flying saucer, I'm going to run down to the Air Force Base and report this. It was more a case of, well, while I'm down there, I'm going to mention it to the sheriff.
This is exactly what I wanted to get to. We have a story from Mac Brazel, who's a no-nonsense cowboy, that is published on the 9th, where he says that he finds this debris field on June 14th with his son. Okay? So that's published on the 9th. Now, let's go back in time just a little bit, and we're going to start with what is told to be the first interview with Brazel. So Brazel goes into Corona, goes to the sheriff's office. While talking to the sheriff, the first interview done with Brazel was at the Roswell Daily Record, and we know that there's 3 other interviews, but the first was done on the spur of the moment by Roswell radio station KGFL announcer Frank Joyce.
That's right. That's who called in. Yeah.
And that's on Sunday, July the 6th. Joyce made it a practice to call the county sheriff, George Wilcox, for news leads. It happened that Brazel was in his office at that time relating the discovery of this strange debris. So Wilcox put Brazel on the telephone and Joyce proceeded to interview him. Now, this interview was taken by the military, presumably, and confiscated by them and has never seen the light of day.
Where did that information come from? Just now that he was interviewed and has never seen the light of day.
Now, I'm reading this from a Thomas J. Carey and a Donald R. Schmidt, and I've seen several interviews with Joyce where he discusses this and says that occurred. I believe it was Joyce I saw who did the interviews who said that's what happened.
So a little bit about Jesse Marcel, a little information about him, who he was, and the area. The 509th Bomb Group in Roswell was the only air wing in the world armed with nuclear weapons. The very first nuclear bomb was created in 1945. This is 1947, and of course, America keeps producing atomic weapons. There was only one bomb group of B-29s in the world. The Soviets had yet to develop an atomic bomb. At this time, the United States is the only country in the world that has atomic weapons, and they are stationed in Roswell, New Mexico. So significant? Perhaps. Perhaps there was more scrutiny for the officers and the men that served at this base because of that, because of the security risk. I'm sure that they wanted to fill this base with highly capable people. So Jesse Marcel, this is from the book, The Roswell Incident. Again, this is the very first book published on the incident. He was major, but he retired from the military as a lieutenant colonel. Jesse A. Marcel, ranking staff officer in charge of intelligence at the Roswell Army Air Base at the time of the incident. Marcel, now retired and living in Louisiana, had been flying since 1928 and, in his own words, was familiar with virtually everything that flew. As one of the few cartographers familiar with both the making and interpreting of aerial maps before World War II, he was sent to intelligence school by the Army Air Force following Pearl Harbor and proved to be so capable a student that upon completion of training, he was retained as an instructor. 15 months later, he applied for and was granted combat duty and went to New Guinea, where he became intelligence officer for his bomber squadron and later for his entire group. Flying as a bombardier, waist gunner, and pilot, he logged 468 hours of combat flying in B-24s. He was awarded 5 air medals for shooting down 5 enemy aircraft and was himself shot down once, and this was on his 3rd mission. Toward the end of the war, Marcel was chosen to become part of the 509th Bomb Wing of the U.S. Army Air Force, the world's only atomic bomb group at the time. As part of this group in 1946, he was instrumental in handling security for the 1946 atomic bomb tests, Operation Crossroads, and that was the Bikini Islands. And you know those videos you see of atomic bombs exploding in the water with all the ships around it? That's Operation Crossroads. They dropped, I think they did 1 airburst and 1 under the water in 1946. In a recent interview with Moore and also Stanton Freeman in February, May, and December of 1979, this is from that interview. So, Major Marcel, did you personally see a crashed UFO? He said, I saw a lot of wreckage, but no complete machine. Whatever it was had to have exploded in the air above ground level. It had disintegrated before it hit the ground. The wreckage was scattered over an area of about 3/4 of a mile long and several hundred feet wide. How did the Roswell base know about the crash at Brazel's Ranch? We heard about it on July 7th when we got a call from the county sheriff at Roswell. I was eating lunch at the officers club when the call came through saying I should go out and talk to Brazel. So they were concerned it may be a downed aircraft of some type, and he goes into a little bit of that. He said, I got a CNC, a counterintelligence corps agent from West Texas by the name of Cavett, and Marcel couldn't recall his first name. So this must have been the plainclothes man that Brazel had mentioned. Followed this man out to the ranch, me driving my staff car, a 42 Buick, and Cabot in a Jeep carryall. There were almost no roads, and at spots we literally had to go right across the country. It was close to the middle of nowhere as you could get. Anyhow, we got there very late in the afternoon and had to spend the night with this fellow. All we had to eat was some cold pork and beans and some crackers. Brazel lived on the southeast side of Corona, quite far. The closest town was 30 miles away. He lived in a dinky house on a sheep ranch, no radio, no telephone, lived there by himself most of the time. It seems to me that Brazel told me that he thought he had heard an odd explosion late in the evening several days earlier during an electrical storm, but paid no special attention to it at the time because he attributed it to just a freak part of the storm. He didn't find the wreckage until the next morning. On Saturday, July 5th, Brazel went into town. He went to Corona. That's where he heard the stories about the flying saucers. On July 6th, Brazel decided he better go to town and report this to someone. They asked him, "Do you think what you saw was a weather balloon?" And Marcel says, "It was not. I was pretty well acquainted with most everything that was in the air at the time, both ours and foreign. I was acquainted with virtually every type of weather observation or radar tracking device being used by either civilians or the military. It was definitely not a weather or tracking device, nor was it any sort of plane or missile. What it was, we didn't know. We just picked up the fragments. It was something I had never seen before, or since for that matter. I didn't know what it was, but it certainly wasn't anything built by us, and it most certainly wasn't any weather balloon." Can you describe the materials found on the site? There were all kinds of stuff. Small beams, about 3/8 of an inch in square, some sort of hieroglyphics on them that nobody could decipher. These looked something like balsa wood and were about the same weight, except they were not wood at all. They were very hard, although flexible, and would not burn. There was a great deal of an unusual parchment-like substance, which was brown in color and extremely strong, and a great number of small pieces of metal like tinfoil, except that it wasn't tinfoil. I was interested in electronics and kept looking for something that resembled instruments or electronic equipment, but I didn't find anything. One of the other fellows, Cabot, I think, found a black metallic-looking box several inches square. As there was no apparent way to open this, and since it didn't appear to be an instrument package of any sort, we threw it in with the rest of the stuff. I don't know what eventually happened to the box, but it went along with the rest of the material we eventually took to Fort Worth. He goes on to describe the material. He said, "One thing that impressed me about the debris was the fact that it looked like parchment, had little numbers with symbols that we had to call hieroglyphics because I could not understand them. They could not be read. They were just like symbols, something that meant something. They were pink and purple. They looked like they were painted on. These little numbers could not be broken, could not be burned. I even took my cigarette lighter out and tried to burn the material we found that resembled parchment and balsa, but it would not burn, wouldn't even smoke. But something that is even more astounding is that the pieces of metal that we brought back were so thin, just like the tinfoil in a pack of cigarettes. I didn't pay too much attention to that at first, until one of the boys came to me and said, 'You know that metal that was in there? I tried to bend the stuff and it won't bend. I even tried it with a sledgehammer. You can't make a dent on it.' This particular piece of metal was about 2 feet long and maybe a foot wide. It was so light it weighed practically nothing. That was true of all the material that was brought up. It weighed practically nothing. It was so thin. So I tried to bend the stuff. We did all we could to bend it. It would not bend. And you could not tear it or cut it either. We even tried making a dent in it with a 16-pound sledgehammer, and there was still no dent in it. It's still a mystery to me what the whole thing was. Now, by bend, I mean crease. It was possible to flex the stuff back and forth, even to wrinkle it, but you could not put a crease in it. That was to say, nor could you dent it at all. I would almost have to describe it as a metal with plastic properties. One of the fellows tried to put some of the pieces together like a jigsaw puzzle. He managed to get about 10 square feet together, but it wasn't enough to get any idea of the general shape of the object. Whatever it was big. What did you do with the material you picked up? We collected all the debris we could handle. We had filled the carryall. I began to fill the trunk and back seat of the Buick. That afternoon, we headed back to Roswell and arrived there in the early evening. When we arrived there, we discovered that the story that we had found a flying disc had leaked out ahead of us. We had an eager beaver, PIO, Public Information Officer, on the base who had taken it upon himself to call the AP on this thing. We had several calls that night, and one reporter even came to the house, but I, of course, couldn't confirm anything to them over the phone. And the man who came to my house, my wife sent over to see the colonel. The next morning, that written press release went out, and after that, things really hit the fan. The phone rang right off the hook. I heard the brass fried him later on for putting out that press release, but then I can't say for sure. And anyway, that afternoon, we loaded everything into the B-29 on orders from Colonel Blanchard and flew it all to Fort Worth. I was scheduled to fly it all the way to Wright in Ohio, but when we got to Carswell in Fort Worth, the general nixed it. So they're talking about General Ramey. He took control of everything then. He wasn't allowed to say anything. Now, he says here, just after we got to Carswell, Fort Worth, we were told to bring some of this stuff up to the general's office, that he wanted to take a look at it. We did this and spread it out on the floor on some brown paper. What we had was only a small portion of the debris. There was a whole lot more. There was half a B-29 full outside. General Ramey allowed some members of the press in to take pictures of this stuff. They took one picture of me on the floor holding up some of the less interesting metallic debris. The press was allowed to photograph this, but were not allowed far enough into the room to touch it. The stuff in that one photo was pieces of the actual stuff we had found. I want to repeat that. The stuff in that one photo was pieces of the actual stuff we had found. It was not a staged photo. Later, they cleared out our wreckage and substituted some of their own. Then they allowed more photos. Those photos were taken while the actual wreckage was already on its way to Wright Field. I was not in these. I believe these were taken with the general and one of his aides. I've seen a lot of weather balloons, but I've never seen one like that before, and I don't think they ever did either. I'm just going to leave it at there. I think that's the most important aspect of the story from Jesse Marcel. That's the crux of it. He found this stuff. Brazel found it on the ranch. He goes to the Air Force Base. Marcel goes out. They collect it, get back. The story hits the wire that they found it. General Ramey puts it's unusual debris. They can't really tell a whole lot about it at this stage. When I read this book the very first time, I thought about it. I did find it interesting how Jesse Marcel says the story had already been released by the time they get back to the base, that they had found that flying disc. I think that's a little telling.
Frank Joyce records and interviews Mac Brazel on July the 6th. And then on July the 7th, the Walt Whitmore, the owner of KGFL, interviews him. And this was done probably on Monday, July 7th, late in the day. The interview was recorded on a wire recorder, which was the technology available at the time. The interview was meant to be aired as a scoop, but was never played on the air, which we mentioned previously. Unfortunately, the recording has been lost to us because it was confiscated by the Army on the afternoon of July the 8th and never returned during the operation to kill the original disc retrieval story and remove all contrary evidence. And this comes from an article constructed by Thomas J. Carey and Donald R. Schmidt. So an interview is conducted with Frank Joyce on 1982 when Moore follows up on a trip locating him in Albuquerque. And in 1947, Joyce was a 24-year-old announcer for KGFL in Roswell, and also a stringer for the United Press Wire Service, meaning he would place interesting stories on the press wire for national pickup. Joyce said that Blanchard press release was delivered to him by hand by Lieutenant Walter Hout, the Roswell Public Information Officer. At the time of the interview with Moore, Joyce was still leery of talking about his involvement in the 1947 event, citing his reluctance to reveal information about what seemed a top-secret topic that could harm national security if disclosed. as well as concerns about his job as a media personality. So it seemed that, understandably, Joyce told the truth to more than, but not the entire truth. According to Joyce, he had been spinning records and reporting the local news on his Sunday afternoon radio show on July the 6th, as was his habit. He called Sheriff Wilcox while the record was playing to inquire about newsworthy items. That's when Wilcox put Brazel on the phone, and Joyce interviewed him off the air. Joyce then suggests to Wilcox that the military be contacted, and Wilcox followed the advice. Curiously, Joyce went on to detail for more what Brazel did not tell him he found during the first interview, such as balloon parts and balsa wood, but there was nothing about Brazel's description of what he did find, which must have formed the substance of the interview. Instead, Joyce talked about Brazel's frame of mind during the conversation, characterizing him as terrified, but without elaboration or explanation. Subsequent interviews with Joyce, which occurred in 1989 and then later in 1998, Joyce eventually reveals the conversation that was lost to time that he had had with Brazel on that day in July 6, 1947. This is the reconstruction according to Joyce. Brazel says, "Who's going to clean all that stuff up? That's what I want to know. I need someone out there to clean it up." Joyce asks, "What stuff? What are you talking about?" Brazel, Don't know what it is. Maybe it's one of them flying saucer things." Joyce, "Oh, really? Then you should call the Army Air Base. They were responsible for everything that flies in the air. They should be able to help you or tell you what it is." Brazel, "Oh God, oh God, oh God. What am I going to do? It's horrible, horrible, just horrible." Joyce, "What is it? What's horrible? What are you talking about?" Brazel, "The stench. Just awful." Joyce, "Stench? From what? What are you talking about?" Brazel, "They're dead." Joyce, "What? Who's dead?" Brazel, "Little people." At this point, Joyce thought to himself, this is crazy. He decided to play the role of devil's advocate to a story he did not believe. Joyce, what are they? Where did you find them?" Brazel, "Somewhere else." "Well, you know, the military is always firing rockets and experimenting with monkeys and things, so maybe?" Brazel, "God damn it, they're not monkeys, and they're not human." With that, Brazel ends the conversation. On July the 9th, they have another interview where Brazel is accompanied by several military men and claims he got the original story wrong, recounts the story that is published in the July 9th paper, where he talks about just picking up balsa wood and pieces of tin foil.
Where did that come from? This was Joyce, who worked for the radio station. That's a reconstruction of the very first interview that he had.
That's correct.
With Brazel.
Right.
And this is according to...
interviews done by William Moore.
William Moore. That's the author of this book.
Mm-hmm. Well, no, some of it also came from Randall and Schmidt.
Okay. Yeah.
That part comes from Carey and Schmidt.
I don't remember that in the first book. Again, some of the stuff in the first book, the main crux of this book, of course, is the interview with Jesse Marcel, who mentioned nothing about seeing any kind of creatures or aliens. And then when they interviewed Brazel's son, he did admit that his dad really didn't want to talk about it much. There's that. But then on the other hand, Brazel doesn't strike me as a big conversationalist anyway.
Yeah, the question is, was he coerced to retell the story a different way by the military? And it seems that
that's the implication.
They had confiscated him for some amount of time, and then he went in and told a different story.
Yeah, 2 accounts of witness intimidation included was the incarceration of Mac Brazel. The UFO report on July 2nd by Dan Wilmot and his wife. The people that were friends with Barnett, who said that in the vicinity of Socorro, New Mexico, about 150 miles west of the Foster Ranch, he and a group of archaeologists stumbled upon an alien craft and its occupants on the morning of July 3rd, only to be led away by military personnel. The book suggests that there was either 2 crafts that crashed or that debris from the vehicle Barnett described had subsequently landed on the Foster Ranch after an explosion. Yeah, I've heard that theory too, where some people say maybe the saucer hit the Foster Ranch, like scraped the ground, left some debris, or maybe there was an explosion and some stuff scattered, but then the ship was traveling so fast it went another 150 miles and then crashed into the side of the hill. And some people say maybe the one that crashed in the side of the hill with the occupants was like an escape pod. You know, I've heard that theory floated as well.
What do you imagine the aliens were saying after they hit the ground the first time and they skip up? Like, pull up, pull up. What does aliens saying pull up sound like?
I'm thinking they said something like, oh, man, nice move. Oh, we're going to make it.
Hold my beer. Watch this stuff.
See you in St. Louis. There was another book published in 1991 with some new witness interviews. Kevin Randall and Donald Schmidt published UFO Crash at Roswell. In this account, the timelines of the incident were slightly altered. The date when Brazil reported the debris and Marcel went to the ranch was said to be Sunday, July 6th, not the next day, which would have been the 7th, which is what was originally reported. As some of the original accounts suggested and the Roswell incident left unclear, Marcel and an unidentified counterintelligence agent were said to have spent the night at the ranch. The two gathered material on Monday. Then Marcel supposedly dropped by his house on the way to Roswell base in the early hours of Tuesday, July 8th. And also, that's one thing I wanted to add. I know for years, Jesse Marcel Jr., his son, was about 11 years old at the time. No, Jesse Marcel Jr. was a doctor, a medical doctor. He also spent some time in the military. I think he retired as an officer in the military. So, you know, not a crackpot by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, his father, according to Jesse Marcel Jr., had stopped by the house with some of this debris and showed it to his family and said, this is from out of this world. And
did he say just like that?
You know, talked to, yeah.
It's from out of that world.
So, yeah, you know, remember on the In Search of interview?
Oh, yeah.
It's not of this earth.
Not of this earth. It's not of this world.
I know it's not of this earth. So, yeah, he showed it to, and of course, for years on documentaries, we saw Jesse Marcel Jr. interviewed, but he has since passed away. And I have some news about Jesse Marcel III. He has, I read an article, this has been almost a year ago.
The Missing Diary.
The Missing Diaries, right. And he was talking about Dad would share with us many more details, often at dinner, with Star Trek playing in the background for effect. He would talk about seeing foil sheets that were incredibly strong and light as a feather, describe the beams with hieroglyphic writing he claimed would appear if you looked at them at an angle. In their book, Witness to Roswell, Thomas J. Carey and Donald R. Schmidt spoke to eyewitnesses who said they saw metal material like that described by our father that returned to its original shape no matter how you twisted it or try to put a wrinkle in it. On summer trips to visit our grandfather, he would add to the story. He told us that he had seen glass-like fiber optic material strewn through the debris in the field and even what appeared to be an animal hit by the craft that had crashed. He would describe how it took 5 to 6 large 2.5-ton 6x6 cargo trucks to transport all the debris back to the base. As we grew older, Grandpa would share more of the story with us, but was still very guarded when it came to telling us too much, maybe out of concern that the information that haunted him would come back to haunt us. We could see on his face that he was conflicted between the need to expose the entire story as he saw it and the need to honor the oath he had taken to his country.
I saw the debris. It was a cloaked spaceship to look like a weather balloon kindergarten project filled with fiber optic cables and dead aliens. We did a forensics, discovered that was likely a murder-suicide pack. Alien number 1 was in a love triangle with alien 2 and 3. It didn't end well for them.
People have asked where the debris ended up or whether our grandfather kept a memento, and if so, where is it? Although his own voice has been silent for almost 3 decades, people still refer to his comments from time to time, and we now have found a diary amongst his things after he died, which has not been shared with the public before. We have wondered whether buried in some of the private writings he has left us is a treasure map for discovering any secrets that have not been fully exposed to the world. One theory is that the diary was written in kind of a homebrew code, and it might point to places where crash debris still exists or contain other revelations our grandfather wanted the world to know. With our memories, documents, and our grandfather's unseen diary, a door is cracking open that was once thought closed. So, yeah, it looks like Jesse Marcel III is going to continue on with the story, and I'm assuming we'll release this diary at some point in the future. This article was published on December 7th, 2020, so that's been, a little over a year ago. So I'm hoping, we'll get a new book here on the hidden diaries declassified and uncovered the truth of the secret diaries of Jesse Marcel. I thought it was interesting how Grandpa went from saying they loaded up the debris in his Buick, the trunk of the Buick, and maybe a Jeep carryall, to they needed six 6x6 trucks to haul it all out. So I don't know. Seems, it took 5 to 6 large 2.5 ton 6x6 cargo trucks to transport all the debris back to the base. And the appearance of the glass-like fiber optic materials that were there. And the animal that was hit, that's a new...
Yeah, so I was looking for some of the Roswell stuff, and I found an interview with a funeral director. I don't think he was a director. He was he worked in a funeral home. In 1947, he was younger, in his 20s, I imagine. And his name is Glenn Dennis. 2 first names?
Glenn Dennis, the man with 2 first names.
The man with 2 first names. That's old man Dennis's boy.
It's Glenn.
Yeah.
It was Dennis.
Dennis and Glenn Dennis.
I know he came from after a 1989 episode of Unsolved Mysteries on the Roswell incident. Glenn Dennis called the show. Is that correct? With his account of the events at Roswell.
Maybe I saw his interview on YouTube, and I'm not sure who was interviewing him, but it seemed very compelling at the time. He seemed like a very matter-of-fact guy.
It says the book, UFO Crash at Roswell, that was published in 1991, prominently featured the stories of mortician Glenn Dennis. On September 20th, 1989, an episode of Unsolved Mysteries had included second-hand stories of Barney Barnett seeing the alien bodies. That's the same person who was mentioned in the book I talked about, the Roswell incident. So Dennis had called the show's hotline claiming to have knowledge of the events. So what did the interview have?
I'd have to do this from memory, so that's what I'm going to do. So Glenn is interviewed, and he talks about an incident that occurred right around the time of the Roswell crash. He was called by someone at the military base because they did do funerary work for the military service, and also they did services for transporting injured people. So he had received a call from them asking him questions about how you would store a body if you didn't want to embalm it without it decaying, and wanted to know what the availability of caskets that were of a smaller size would be, if they have any in stock, if they had them there, how long it would take them to get there, if they needed some. And these were all just posed as hypotheticals. He found it strange, unusual, to say the least, but maybe something odd had happened and they just needed smaller caskets because there were injuries and crashes. It was a testing facility, and they did have some cases from time to time where they would have some deaths related to the work that they do at the base.
Well, Glenn Dennis also claimed that a local nurse told him she had witnessed an alien autopsy.
Right. So after he gets this strange call from the base, sometime after that, there is an injury. Somebody has a car crash, a military personnel. He has to go pick them up in the funerary car to transport them, the hearse. So the guy's still alive. He just sits in the front seat. His face is beat up pretty bad. And he drives him to the military base where he knows a nurse that he's interested in who serves on the base. So he drops off this military officer or serviceman. I don't remember if it was an officer or a serviceman. He drops him off at the hospital, and then he goes in to look for her to see if, he could just have a chat with her. He's in the hallway, and he sees her come out of a room, and she seems a bit distraught and tells him he's got to leave right now. He shouldn't be there. And on his way in, he had noticed in the back of several large trucks various pieces of debris, which looked odd. He had just assumed that there had been a crash. So he has a confrontation with a couple of military officers there, one of which is a red-haired officer, a captain, I think, and he has this altercation with them verbally where he gets taken off base, escorted off the base, and told not to say anything to anybody, and they threaten him, which he doesn't appreciate. He leaves, and eventually he comes back and has a lunch with this nurse where she describes an autopsy that she took part in, assisting the doctors that were there in this autopsy, and describes these small humanoid figures, large eyes, big heads, what we all know, about 4 feet tall, 3 fingers, I guess, 3 or 4 fingers, 3 fingers, I think, with little suction cups on the tips, which was a detail she added. She says, don't talk to anybody about it. She drew a little bit of a picture of them on a napkin, I think. So he leaves, and then when he tries to contact her later, he is told that she has been transferred overseas. And then when he continues to try to track her down, he gets a letter back that says that she's deceased and had died in a airplane crash, if I remember correctly. All of this we can link on our Facebook page. We'll provide a link to the actual interview so you guys can watch it. But that I thought was a really interesting interview because it was done, he was probably in his 20s in the 1940s, and the interview, I think, was in November of 1990. So he's an older man now while he's telling his story, and he's very matter-of-fact about it. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't be embellishing or maybe changing a little bit, or maybe it had nothing to do with anything bizarre, but certainly it lends a little bit of, I don't know if I want to say credibility, but I do want to say just the way he tells it seems convincing to me.
Yeah, I have seen that interview. It is, and he does seem as if he's being truthful about it. Well, we'll come back to that next week as we start breaking down some of these things. He passed away in 2015, by the way. He is the founder of the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell.
So possibly some monetary motivations there?
Well, probably just decided to cash in on it. You go to Roswell, look at pictures of Roswell, New Mexico now. They have most certainly made the best of it, made a tourist attraction, similar to what we talk about Mothman up here all the time, in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. I think it's about like Point Pleasant to the 10th degree up there in Roswell because, they have the big festivals every year and just have museums, restaurants, everything's. I think even the street lights have like an alien head on them in some places in awesome. The town. Yeah, they've really embraced it there. Since the Roswell Air Force Base is closed now, so that really hurt the town. I saw that in some interview some time back where the mayor was talking about where they, the tourism from the UFO stuff really helps them out now that the military base is closed because it employed a lot of people in town. Let's see. So that was the Roswell incident in 1980. Talked about that book at length. The UFO crash at Roswell in 1991 was published by Kevin Randall and Donald Schmidt. They added testimony from about 100 new witnesses, including those who reported an elaborate military cordon and debris recovery operation at the Foster Ranch. The book includes new claims of a gouge that extended 400 or 500 feet at the ranch. That, I will go ahead and point out, contradicts what we just read from the interview from Jesse Marcel, who said it obviously exploded in the air because there wasn't any kind of thing. There wasn't anything on the ground. Randall and Schmidt reported that General Arthur Exon had been directly aware of the debris and bodies, but Exon disputed his depiction in the book, saying his comments had been based exclusively on secondhand rumors. The 1991 book sold 160,000 copies and served as a basis for the 1994 television film Roswell. Also in 1991, retired U.S. Air Force Brigadier General Thomas DuBois, who had posed with the debris for the press photographs in 1947, publicly acknowledged the weather balloon cover story corroborating Marcel's previous admissions. Now, I have a little something to talk about that when we come back to that. Barnett's alien body accounts were mentioned in the 1991 book, though the dates and locations were changed from the accounts found in the 1980 Roswell incident. In this new account, Brazel was described as leading the Army to a second crash site on the ranch, at which point the Army personnel were supposedly horrified to find civilians, including Barnett, there already. And then in 1992, Stanton Friedman, who first broke this story and found Jesse Marcel, released a book called The Crash at Corona that was co-authored with Don Berliner. The book introduces new witnesses and added the narrative by doubling the number of flying saucers to 2 and the number of aliens to 8, 2 of which were said to have survived and been taken into custody by the government. In 1994, Randall and Schmidt authored another book, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell, which included a claim that the alien bodies were taken by cargo plane to be viewed by Dwight D. Eisenhower. The existence of so many differing accounts led to a schism among ufologists about the events at Roswell. The Center for UFO Studies and the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, the two leading UFO societies, disagreed in their views on the various scenarios presented by Randall, Schmidt, and Friedman and Berliner. Several conferences were held to try and resolve the differences. One issue under discussion was where Barnett was when he saw the alien craft. A 1992 UFO conference attempted to achieve a consensus among the various scenarios portrayed in the crash at Corona and the UFO crash at Roswell. However, the publication of The Truth About the UFO crash at Roswell resolved the Barnett problem by simply ignoring Barnett and citing a new location for the alien craft recovery, including a new group of archaeologists not connected with the ones of the Barnett story.
That's convenient.
Yeah, and let's wrap this thing up. I mean, you might have a little something you want to add to, but there was the alien autopsy film that came out in 1995. Let's not forget that. The Fox special. This was where film footage reportedly showing an alien autopsy was claimed to have been taken by a U.S. military officer. It was released by Ray Santilli, a London-based video entrepreneur. And then, of course, since then, the person that actually made the film, I can't remember. I don't have his name here. He came forward some years afterwards and said it was a hoax. No, Santilli's the one that owns the film now. He bought the film.
Oh, you're talking about the person who actually...
Yeah, but then Santilli admitted in 2006 that the film was mostly a reconstruction, but continued to claim it was based on genuine footage now lost, and some of the original frames that had supposedly have survived. And that's what he tried to auction. If you remember that about a year ago when he had the big auction
last year.
for like $1 million, one frame for like $1 million. I talked about it on the podcast. I don't think it ever sold. 1994, the Air Force, this was under, I remember Congressman Schiff from New Mexico had a lot of constituents saying, hey, we want to know about those flying saucers that crashed out here in the desert. So the United States General Accounting Office launched an inquiry and directed the Office of the United States Secretary of the Air Force to conduct an internal investigation. And the first one was released in 1994, addressed the UFO crash, and they said that it was likely from a Project Mogul military surveillance program of high-altitude balloons that were classified at the time. And then later, when people still, ufologists and others still wanted to know about the bodies and the UFO occupants that were reportedly seen, they published another book in 1997 called, that one was called, I've got both books right here. The first book was called The Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction. That's the one that was published in 1994. And the second book, published by the Air Force, that wanted to address the alien bodies, the alleged aliens that were seen, they investigated that and concluded that most likely they were these dummies used in high-altitude flights in the early space program and things like that people came across in the desert. They said if somebody was collecting it, well, they were collecting it. We'll cover that a little more in depth next week. But that book was published in 97, and it is called The Roswell Report, Case Closed. And I think by that second title, the Air Force is saying, we're done. You got your 2 books here. And this is all we can find out about Roswell.
It's good reading.
It is good reading. I actually read, I read the first one I read a bunch of it last year, and then for this episode, I read the first one and read some of the second one. I specifically want to look at the first one to just talk about the crash in general.
Just the only other thing maybe to mention is that in 2011, Annie Jacobson, a journalist, comes out with a book titled Area 51, An Uncensored History of America's Top Secret Military Base. Now, it's an interesting collection of stories and accounts, and she even was able to tour parts of Area 51. Now, Area 51 is just one area of a larger area made up of lots of different subsections. So there's like
Groom Lake.
Yeah.
And the government didn't even admit this place existed, I think, until maybe the Obama administration.
That's correct. It was never named.
We know for a fact that's where the Skunk Works, where they develop top secret military aircraft and aerospace craft there. For instance, the SR-71 was developed there. Our spy planes, the B-2 bomber. That's where they go out and test fly this stuff in the remote desert. They used to. They've probably moved it because there's so many UFO people hanging around all the time now.
Right.
Trying to get a look at one of them there saucers.
So she had in her book, Annie Jacobson had this book, Area 51, An Uncensored History of America's Top Secret Military Bases, had 70 plus people who had actually worked at Area 51 go on record to talk about their experiences there.
Was Bob Lazar in it?
Bob Lazar was not in it because he worked at Area S4. So,
okay.
Right. According to Bob. But according to everyone else you ask, he worked like the cafeteria line at Los Alamos's offsite base or something like that. Which is true, I don't know, and I don't claim to know. I'm not going to weigh in on Bob. But I will say that she had one chapter, maybe not even a chapter, where she was trying to decide whether to put it in, and she probably put it in just because she knew she would get, or her editor knew that she would get more sales from this one chapter where she discusses one of the people she interviewed who was a prominent senior nuclear scientist who made the claim, and he was elderly at the time that she wrote this book, made the claim that the crash in Roswell was actually a product of Joseph Stalin's Russia, where he had sent over a saucer-shaped craft that they had dropped from the sky from a plane. And no kidding, Mengele, the insane Joseph Mengele, the insane German SS officer and doctor at Auschwitz, had fled to Russia and come up with this program where he modified disabled or mentally challenged children and had mangled their bodies in a way to make them look like these little aliens, put them into this craft, dropped it into Roswell as a sort of like a propaganda campaign to terrify the United States. And that was a claim that this person made. Now, our friend George Knapp over at Mystery Wire, who is a reporter and covers a lot of the UFO stuff, says that he knows this person that Annie Jacobson talks to. And he had received a story from that same individual that was nothing like that story. It was a completely different story and supported the idea that there was an actual crash in Roswell and had nothing to do with Joseph Stalin and Mengele. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, that's noteworthy. I know there was another book published recently. I don't have it here that takes a whole different angle, and it's the Russian angle.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go ahead and just say they didn't have the technology to do that in those days. And if they had the technology to do that, where is it now? It would have emerged in the past 70 years, 80 years. How long has it been?
I don't think they were claiming that they actually dropped a flying saucer. I'm thinking they
didn't have the technology to fly an airplane over here.
Oh, seriously?
In 1947. They copied the B-29. It was a Tupolev Tu-4.
Mm-hmm.
They had actually commandeered a couple that had landed in Russia near Vladivostok when they were on a Japanese, bombing China. I think maybe some sites in China or Manchuria, and had engine trouble and landed, and then they wouldn't turn it back over. In fact, they interned the crew for a while, and they were supposed to be our allies during World War II. But anyway, they decided to keep them. And they reverse engineered these airplanes. So it's possible they could have gotten an aircraft over here, but highly unlikely, especially if they flew it over the pole and had to go all the way to New Mexico. I don't know an airbase it's possible. I'd have to sit down and do the math.
Could they
check the range on a B-29, and I'm assuming that a Tu-4 would have been similar. But I mean, I don't think the problem with those stories, every time I hear that it's a Russian thing or something of ours in 1940s, is that technology would have emerged by now.
Well, maybe they shot it out of a cannon. Like, could they have shot it out of a cannon over into Mexico?
The Russians put the first artificial satellite in orbit in 1957, and it was a big propaganda coup. And I would say that if the Russians could do something like that and would do something like that, they probably would have used it as propaganda. They would have used, I don't buy that at all. I think she's reporting on something that's in that someone told her.
Yeah.
And George Knapp obviously, and then, heard something similar. Although George Knapp says this individual said it was actually an alien spacecraft.
Right.
And he's telling her that as a cover story.
Exactly.
I don't know.
That's right. The claim anyway.
And in 2007, Donald Schmidt and Tom Carey published the book Witness to Roswell, which prominently featured a document said to be a sworn affidavit by Walter Haut, who was the press officer at Roswell that released that information in 1947. The document alleged to have been left by Haut and opened only after his death in 2005. It includes a description of the 1947 crash debris having been discussed by high-ranking staff and how Haut had seen alien bodies. Then there's your Stalin Mengele conspiracy.
Well, I just want to go back to that Walter Haut thing. That letter wasn't written in his penmanship. It was written in somebody else's penmanship. And yeah. And his mental state was at that time was such that he couldn't recall basic details about his past, like his name, where he lived. what colors are blue.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say, I mean, I'm just going to say it. I mean, you have the original story from
The 1940s.
40 years ago now, 1980. And here we are 42 years later, and, you know, people are still trying to publish books. I mean, there was just a History Channel special recently that said Roswell, new witnesses. I mean, it was on the History Channel about Roswell again. So it just feels like now it's just trying to milk the cow and come up with things. And of course, you can always put the disclaimer. If I publish a book, I can say, I don't know if this document is real or legitimate, but it was handed to me by the bearded lady down on there and said it was top secret. And then you publish it, but you don't have to say that it's legitimate. You just say, hey, I was handed this, but under shady circumstances, or this was left for somebody after his death in the case of Walter Haut. So, who knows?
Thank you for that.
Well,
now I have material for my first book.
Exactly.
Chapter 1, The Bearded Lady.
Well, we have run incredibly long on part 1. Thank you, listeners, if any are still out there. I hope you are finding this story riveting. Next week, we are going to delve into it a little deeper. We're not going to delve into every single piece here, but we do have some very specific things we want to talk about to try and get to the bottom of the Roswell incident. Is it a crash saucer? Is it a weather balloon? Or a temperature inversion? Or ball lightning? We're going to get to that in part 2 next week. Jimmy, do you have anything else you want to add to the podcast?
Yeah, I think it was a Bigfoot fart.
Could be. It was Bigfoot. All right. Well, with all that being said, this is Stephen Hawk signing out. And we'll see you next week.
Jimmy Coe, keep your eyes to the skies and your feet on the ground and your nose clenched in case Bigfoot farts. We'll catch you next week.
Well, you never know. You've got to keep it clenched for all those rotting alien bodies like Brazil had.
Oh, that's right. It's
the
nasty.
stench.
The stench.
The stench.
Oh, God, the stench. I'm falling apart. I'm a tough cowboy, but I can't take the stench of a couple of dead alien babies.
They got to do something.
Get this, clean this stuff up out of my farm.
All I know is not of this earth.
You're freaking out my sheep.
All right, man. I'll see you.
See ya. That's all for this week's episode of Cosmic Sponge. Please don't forget to rate and review us wherever you listen. It helps others find the show. If you have any questions or have a story you'd like to share, you can contact us using our email account at firstcontact@cosmicsponge.com. If you'd like to support the show, consider becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/cosmicsponge, where you get access to exclusive content, including our Weird Wonders news and stories released every week. To explore everything Cosmic Sponge has to offer, including other ways to support the show, head on over to our website at www.cosmicsponge.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.